Hi, everyone. My name is Regina Paulos, and I'm the Executive Director of the Common Good Foundation. And I'm here today with my fabulous research team to launch our report on business and human rights in South Asia. This report you can find and download at no cost on our website at actwithus.org. And you can follow us on our social media accounts on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at Common Good FDN. I want to take a moment to thank Sienna and Ronnie, who've been working behind the scenes to help us launch this report. And I want to thank our fabulous board of advisors who continue to support us in these endeavors. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone on to Kathryn and Taanya, who've been working with me for a little bit of time and who've worked tirelessly to make this report happen. Kathryn, the floor is yours.
Hello. So my research focused on Indigenous populations within the SAARC region with a specific focus on how their lives and rights may be affected by business. Indigenous communities are defined as having historical continuity with pre-colonial and pre-invasion societies and are determined to preserve, develop and transmit their ethnic identity and ancestral homes to future generations, but also to govern themselves according to their own social institutions, cultural patterns, and legal systems. While the guiding principles on business and human rights makes no explicit mention of Indigenous persons, the commentary does outline that a number of principles are relevant and should be read so as to protect Indigenous persons. Within the SAARC region, the term Indigenous is often supplanted with the term tribal, on the understanding that in the post-independence societies, all people are Indigenous. However, tribal still connotes the same meanings of traditional, cultural, and historical continuity. Within the SAARC region, with the exception of the Maldives, where the Givaru people were assimilated in the 1970s, each of the states are ethnically diverse, with varying degrees of Indigenous populations. For example, in Nepal, 35% of the population identify as Indigenous. In India, the scheduled tribes make up 8.6% of the population, equivalent to 104 million people. While in Sri Lanka, the Wanyala Ato people are numbered at only 2,000. Over the last couple of decades, there have been a number of really important and successful developments with regards to Indigenous rights within the SAARC region. For instance, Pakistan has recently merged the federally administered tribal area, which had previously been under emergency laws for several decades, with a neighboring province, and promised an investment package of $865 million US. Bangladesh has also underscored its commitment to tribal populations in its 7th five-year plan, and Nepal has ratified the International Labour Organization's Convention 169, which outlines a number of up-to-date guidelines and obligations relating to business and tribal populations. Despite these developments, however, my research evidenced a number of themes which ran throughout the SAARC member states, particularly marginalization, the encroachment of territory, of Indigenous territories, and the shortcomings within the education sector. Marginalization is by far the largest and most prevalent issue concerning Indigenous people's rights. The exclusion of Indigenous peoples from the social, economic, and political spheres of power has severe and ongoing implications with regards to their access to a fair labour market. Evidence from SAARC member states affirms that both direct and indirect discrimination resulting from perceived indigeneity is a commonplace experience for IPs. This has subsequently infused the labour market and labour hierarchy, with Indigenous populations often being found in manual labour and high-risk jobs. The formal institutions within many states have set about targeting negative stereotypes and divisive stigmas. However, within the informal sector and business sector, preferential treatment and pre-beliefs about backwardness and other negative stereotypes remains prevalent. This is compounded for Indigenous women, who often bear the brunt of intersectional discrimination, resulting in being peripheralized both within their local communities and at a national level. For instance, in Bangladesh, opportunities for women in the private sector are marred by discriminatory hiring practices, lower wages, and violence. Similarly, in Nepal, it's been highlighted that Indigenous women invariably showed lower levels of employment and often occupied unskilled jobs in the informal sector. Businesses are uniquely placed to be able to combat these issues and to engage with dialogues of inclusion while developing anti-discrimination policies and equal opportunities programs within their own systems with a focus on Indigenous rights. The second theme covered within the report is that of land rights. This is where Indigenous people and businesses often come to a more media recognized form of conflict. The importance of land should not be understated. It is fundamental for the collective physical and cultural survival of peoples and is often interwoven with religious, cultural, and traditional practices. To this extent, a number of human rights mechanisms have highlighted the need to gain free, prior, and informed consent from Indigenous populations before administrative and legislative measures are put in place. For businesses, it is essential that they are proactive, particularly in localities where administrative policies are opaque and complicated land disputes continue. This may require engaging with due diligence and carrying out impact assessments, while also ensuring that if a development does take place, that Indigenous peoples are consulted and also receive benefits as a result of these developments. It is important not only for Indigenous peoples for this process to take place, but also for businesses, as it may result in them avoiding lengthy and expensive legal suits further down the line. Within the SARC region, the impact of 3 key sectors was highlighted within the report. That is forests and conservation, development projects, and mining and resource extraction. Forests were particularly important within the SARC region, as it is noted for its wide biological and ecological diversity, and the need to protect endangered species, particularly tigers. However, there is a perceived conflict with the need for environmental conservation and the ability of Indigenous populations to continue to practice cultural traditions and religious rights. This is in spite of evidence that IPs achieve equal, if not better, conservation results. A particular concern highlighted within the report is the existence of fortress conservation. This has been particularly highlighted with reference to the Waniala Ato people in Sri Lanka, who have been excluded from their traditional lands and forced to the outskirts of forests. Despite new agreements, reports have suggested that a number of Waniala Ato have since been killed, beaten, and arrested by park guards for hunting on their ancestral lands. Ironically, while Indigenous lifestyles have been criminalized, their homes have been opened up for tourists and logging. This is particularly concerning given the ongoing nature of the problem. Furthermore, with regards to development, all SARC member states have voted to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals, which highlight the need for clean water, sustainable energy, improved infrastructure, and education. However, it's essential that in the realization of these goals, that all of the population's needs are taken into account. To this extent, the flooding of lands for hydroelectric dams and the widening of roads and development of infrastructure must also take into account the needs of Indigenous populations and the requirement to gain free, prior, and informed consent. Finally, with regards to mineral and resource extraction, it's important to highlight that human rights bodies and Indigenous rights does not foreclose the ability of states to profit from these resources, but it outlines that it must be done in a safe and ethical manner, and it must be done with the consultation of Indigenous populations. This requires a meaningful engagement, but also ensuring that Indigenous populations gain work and profits on an equal level with other business interests. Within the research, it was highlighted that this is most relevant with regards to Afghanistan. Its opening economy has created an opportunity for the state to benefit from the mineral resources, which are valued at 1 trillion, and offer the possibility of generating $2 billion in revenue per annum. Unfortunately, these resources have been abused in the past and have been subjected to corrupt practices and international interests, which have consistently overlooked the impact upon and needs of Indigenous populations and tribal populations. Finally, the research highlighted the importance of education in breaking the cycles of poverty and marginalization. Human rights bodies have underscored the importance to develop and implement education systems in cooperation with Indigenous peoples, in particular addressing their special needs, their histories, their knowledge and technologies, as well as their value systems and an ability to realize their social, economic and political aspirations. Bangladesh, for instance, has taken a number of steps within its 7th five-year plan to realize these commitments. In particular, it is sought to provide print resources for primary schools within different languages, as well as establishing schools in remote regions. This progress is to be massively commended. Unfortunately, this progress hasn't been met across the region. There is a worrying development of factory schools, which emphasize assimilation of Indigenous children. In the Maharashtra region of India, reports indicate that nearly 1,500 tribal children died in residential schools between 2001 and 2016, including over 30 suicides. These institutes are consequently supported by businesses and pride themselves on transforming tax consumers into taxpayers, liabilities into assets. Divorcing children from their cultural and traditional backgrounds and from their families is overtly harmful and violates a number of human rights. Businesses must engage with these practices, and they must investigate labor conditions and supply chains, while also critically analyzing how they engage with local communities. My colleague Taanya will now discuss the relationship between child rights and SARC. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn. So while I was reading for child rights, the most clear and overwhelming conclusion for the region of SARC is that the situation with regard to children's rights is pretty dismal. The International Labour Organization has reported that millions of South Asian children remain trapped in child labor in this region. In 2011, the South Asian Initiative to End All Violence Against Children became the apex body for SARC, with its mission to end all forms of violence against children. However, it remained unclear whether it was successful in doing so through its programs. In 2012, SARC signed a memorandum of understanding with the International Labour Organizations, interestingly, which did not mention the guiding principles for business and human rights. It was evident after my research and case reports, which I read, that businesses and states must integrate and genuinely enforce the framework around business and human rights, which is intricately connected to violence against children and child right abuses. While researching for this report, the main factors causing violation for children's rights is the extensive use of child labor in this region of SARC. The child labor is used mainly due to the lack of enforcement of legal provisions, a lack of data, and extreme poverty which is prevalent in this region. In India, for instance, there is a clear legal prohibition against employing children below the age of 18 years. However, more than 51% of workers documented in the northern part of the country began working in home-based garment work as children. The textile industry has a very large presence in India and employs children as well. In 2010, the Sumangali scheme was revealed through media intervention, through which young girls were lured into bonded labor, and which were Dalit women, which are protected. Many human rights violations in relation to this scheme have been reported by various NGOs. In order to tackle this issue, brands which use their labor have been notified and efforts have been made to ensure that young girls are not exploited and in the supply chains. And the Sumangali bonded labor group was established by European brands, and which consists of nearly 20 brands and retailers who have united to address this issue of bonded labor in India. In Pakistan, the situation is much more dismal, where small factories hire children as young as 13-year-olds in order to avoid paying them basic minimum wages. The Human Rights Watch has conducted investigations in Pakistan, which have shown that children who are workers in these factories do not have any written contracts with the management because they are under 18 years old and they do not hold national identification cards, which is the pretext for denying them any minimum wage or the official wage of the country. With regard to environment, the region as such is increasing its development agenda and threatens its environmental concerns with respect to human rights. Air pollution is one of the main issues in the SAARC region, with India as a top contender for the worst air, followed by Pakistan and Bangladesh. Corporate entities definitely and inevitably have a role to play in either increasing or protecting the environment of this region. KBR Incorporated, a private military firm in Afghanistan, for example, received criticism for the health risk benefits inflicted upon Afghanistan civilians as well as US army soldiers because of open air burn pits where tires and medical wastes were burnt in open air areas, which led to the spread and inhalation of toxic fumes, where later KBR escaped all responsibility and liability because it was acting under military direction and was immune from all claims. What we wanted to highlight through this video was a small glimpse into our report and what we attempted to do. And these are a few excerpts from there. We would definitely encourage everybody to download the report and go through it, and definitely give us feedback, comments, and share their views at actwithus.org. Thank you.